15 miles from the nearest land, 60 feet beneath the Gulf of Mexico, lies a relic of eons past. But it's not a shipwreck or anything made by humans. This is much older, from a time long before man even dreamt of sailing ships across the sea. Here, just off the coast of Alabama, lies an ancient forest of giant trees. Covered in dense carpets of sea anemones and swarming with schools of fish, this strange underwater world is unlike anything ever seen before. For here, 10 fathoms down, stand the stumps of thousands of trees, still rooted in the mud they grew in 50,000 years before Egypt's Great Pyramids were built. You can even trace the path of an ancient river that once wove through this forest when it was dry land. Following the river as it meanders through the forest, you weave among trees covered in sponges and crabs instead of squirrels and birds. Scientists are just beginning to understand what the forest tells us about our past and what clues it may hold for our future in an era of rising sea levels. Unmistakable to eyes that have seen the swamps that ring the Gulf Coast and the American South, the trees are cypress, native of southern freshwater swamps, obvious from the craggy outline of the trunk that is the hallmark of the species. Another telltale sign is the ring of distinctive knees that surround each trunk. The knees are believed to help the trees stay upright in the soupy mud at the bottom of the great swamps. Unbelievably, it appears the knees have been performing the same function, buried beneath the Gulf of Mexico for millennia. But how did they get here? Most of the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico looks like a barren, sandy desert, home to starfish and jellyfish, but not the forest, which swarms with life like a coral reef. Why are these trees here in this one spot and nowhere else? And how did they get discovered so far offshore in the vast sea? Our story begins with Hurricane Ivan, one of the largest storms to hit the Gulf of Mexico in a century. A Class 4 hurricane, Ivan brought crushing waves and 140-mile-per-hour winds. Massive oil rigs were washed ashore, and condominiums on the beach were crumpled. The storm's path brought it right up the Gulf of Mexico to the Alabama coastline. A series of government data buoys far offshore recorded 98-foot-tall waves, the largest ever measured, before the buoys were ripped loose from their moorings. Tracing Ivan's path from the buoys to where it made landfall, and you can see the centre of the storm pass directly over the spot where dive shop owner Chaz Broughton discovered the forest.
So we got a phone call about a spot producing fish that there wasn't a tremendous amount of show, and it wasn't on any of the charts. Asked us we'd come out and check it out, and rolled off the boat the first day and got down there, and there's just this, it looked like a prehistoric riverbed just running along the sand there with trees just coming out of it, out over the, like a stream would, trees coming out over a stream. And right then you knew you had something just totally different than what you've ever seen in the Gulf of 25 years of diving. So it was quite magnificent.
After discovering the forest, Broughton's first move was to bring environmental journalist Ben Raines to the site.
I remember the first time Chaz took me out to the underwater forest. It just blew my mind. It looked like someone had taken a modern-day cypress forest, like where we are right now, and plopped it down on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. You could see the big swelling bottoms of the cypress trees. You could see the knees. You could see the limbs. You could see tree trunks laying on the bottom. There was still bark on the trees. It was absolutely extraordinary. You know, it's like a coral reef. Every stump is just covered in anemones, there are octopus all over, all kinds of fish. Each stump has its own little Beau Gregory, this little blue and yellow, beautiful little fish that guards it. He's real territorial about it. There are flame cardinal fish out there, which is normally a nocturnal fish you usually see in caves and things, and they're living in the little nooks and crannies of the stumps. Eels, you know, all kinds of strange crabs and things. Then these big predator fish will come swooping in. It's just a really, really extraordinary environment. Sea turtles everywhere. When we came up from the first dive, the first thing I said was, we've got to get some scientists out here. I did some news articles. They just went viral on the internet. We were instantly getting emails and calls from Japan, from China. People all over the world wanted to see this thing. We also started getting calls from salvage companies. And these were companies that wanted to mine the logs from the bottom. They actually wanted to pull them up and make things out of them. Coffee tables, electric guitars, you know, a 50,000-year-old coffee table, for instance. They started offering us quite a lot of money for the coordinates. So we took it upon ourselves to protect the site. We haven't given the number to anyone, and we're working through the process to have it declared a National Marine Sanctuary, which looks like it's going to go through. It's going very well. The other thing we did was start bringing scientists out there. Lots and lots of scientists.
Rains and Broughton turned to a handful of scientists and invited them to explore the site and tell them what they could about how trees came to be rooted in the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. One of the first was Martin Becker, a paleontologist. Becker specialises in ancient shark teeth and other marine fossils, which he usually finds on land. He was instantly fascinated and began digging and prodding around on the site. Almost immediately, he attracted some unwanted attention. A sandbar shark, small but quite aggressive, charged both Marty and our camera crew. He was to be the first of many sharks encountered at the ancient site. Biting a small sheep's head, the visitor eased away, crunching his prey with razor-like teeth. Becker, undaunted, went right back to work.
Was that cool?
That was so cool. Awesome, absolutely awesome.
Trees just everywhere.
Oh, man.
In the Gulf of Mexico.
It's just terrific.
Yep.
It takes a while to take it all in, for sure.
Becker said that in order to understand how the forest came to be where it is, it would probably help to understand a little bit about his work, which documents massive changes in sea level.
The place we're collecting in is really very, very exciting because we're about 100 miles from the nearest shoreline, and we're pulling out fossilized shark's teeth from this modern creek. And certainly you don't see any sharks swimming around behind you. No, more than half the state of Alabama at one time was submerged underneath an ancestral ocean that dates back to the age of the dinosaurs. And the record of that actually is recorded in the fossils and in the regional geology, like where we're sitting right now in this beautiful modern creek with waterfalls, and we're sitting around looking also at a forest, you know. So you're looking at something on the order from the ancient forest, the submerged forest, to where we're sitting at about 125 miles of distance, you know, the water in that area is about 60 feet deep. So, you know, we're talking about a substantial amount of sea level change. So at one time, that area obviously was like a modern cypress forest is today, and sea level has subsequently risen. It's on its way up now, and it's going to return to this area that we're sitting in. And when it returns, so will the sharks. It's just going to be a while.
Sea levels rise and fall in connection with the ice ages the Earth experiences every 40 to 100,000 years. During warm periods, such as the Earth experienced around the time of the dinosaurs 100 million years ago, huge portions of the United States were covered by a vast and ancient sea, which explains the shark's teeth found by Marty's crew. During the cool periods, sea levels fall because much of the water on Earth ends up frozen in glaciers. In the last ice age, 12 to 18,000 years ago, sea levels were 400 feet lower, and the Gulf shoreline was about 30 miles farther offshore than it is today. but scientists think that the forest is much older than that, dating to another ice age more than 50,000 years ago. Christine DeLong is a paleoclimatologist. She usually works with corals, studying the ancient climate by drilling out core samples.
All right, Ben, stay tuned.
She couldn't turn down the chance to work with the cypress.
So today we're hoping to go down and take a couple cores with our increment borers. We typically use these on land with live trees. So doing this underwater with dead trees is going to be an experiment to see if it works. Typically we don't core or use increment borers on dead trees. So it'll be interesting to see if we're able to actually take a core and bring it up and everything in one piece. Then we're hoping to see the bands in the bald cypress. And looking at those bands, it'll tell us, one, what type of environment it was growing in. So if it was more like a river with water flowing through, or if it was more still with peat. From the climate perspective, if we have a river flowing through, this should give us a nice climate reconstruction versus a peat-based bottom. The trees are really happy and they don't vary their growth year to year, so it doesn't tell us a whole lot about climate. So we're hoping to see, one, can we get cores? So these trees have been exposed now about 9 years to the marine environment, and typically with wood it disintegrates quickly, but because these are cypress, they're holding up a lot longer than they normally would. So it'll be interesting to see, so I'm excited.
Here we go, ready? You okay? Very good, okay.
When we first came down off the anchor line, there was like a cypress stump. It almost looked like it had been cut off, and you could see the buttress features and everything around it, but it was really low profile to the bottom. Then there was like a ledge running along the side, and at first glance it looked like sediment layers, but then when I went over, started touching it, it's wood. So it's like layers and layers of wood. So these trees have been exposed now about 9 years to the marine environment, and typically with wood it disintegrates quickly, but because these are cypress, they're holding up a lot longer than they normally would. So.
Christine drills the coring machine into the stump by hand. The goal is to get a clean sample of wood from the heart of the tree, beyond the outer surface, which has been damaged by marine worms that bore into the wood. These interior pieces will be used to figure out how old the trees are using a method known as radiocarbon dating. Christine also wants to collect as much wood as possible that is still buried in the sediment on the seafloor, where it is more protected from decomposition. The silty mud at the site is proof that this part of the Gulf has a very different history from most areas. The river mud here rises in big clouds whenever it is disturbed. That mud is also the reason why the trees have remained intact through the millennia. Buried beneath a thick layer of mud, no oxygen could get to them. And underwater, no oxygen means no decomposition. The trees are brought up to Grant Harley, a dendrochronologist or tree scientist, specialising in bald cypress. Not a scuba diver, he relied on Broughton's team to bring him samples to examine.
I got it,
Wow. You see the center of the tree right here in this region. This would be the center, and this the outer bark area here. And
is this better or worse than you had expected? Or?
it's better, much better than I expected. Yeah, it's very intact. You know, it's oh my goodness. Still got bark on it. That's awesome. Still have bark on it, man. Man, it's awesome.
Bark on it still?
Yeah, and here's that's a gallery from a beetle.
Yeah.
Probably a beetle or some kind of insect right, that was burrowing into the bark. And then here's the gallery right there. Wow. So you can tell like this is probably a trunk of a tree, which is great. From what I see here, the growth rings look really narrow, very tight growth, which is an indication that these trees were stressed by something in the environment.
Very little every year.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what you want to see. You don't want to. I don't want to see big fat rings.
Yeah.
See really, really tight, narrow rings. Yeah, you can see the rings actually in that grain right there. So this is, you know, looking through the tree, standing up straight. Okay. And you can actually see all the little grains right there, very tight rings. It's really, really good. This is definitely a tree trunk, not a root or a branch. Phenomenal.
Excited by the condition of the wood, Grant persuades the dive team to try and bring up a large stump. It's a dangerous proposition, as the stump must be raised using nothing more than bags of air inflated from dive tanks. Once rigged, the stump floats gently off the bottom. The divers have to carefully control the amount of lift by adjusting the amount of air in the bags. Much like a hot air balloon pilot controls his altitude by adding or releasing helium. Vent too much air and the stump begins to sink. If anything goes wrong, the stump could drop suddenly, pulling an unsuspecting diver to the depths, or, more dangerous, overinflated bags could cause the stump to rise rapidly, possibly leaving the dive team with a life-threatening case of the bends. At the surface, the mammoth size of the stump becomes apparent.
This thing is huge, Grant.
As does the fact that the crew is going to have a very difficult time trying to pull the stump from the sea. They attach lines to the stump and prepare to hoist it aboard.
Alright, you want to see what you got?
But it's no use. It's too big. So they settle for the next best thing, sawing off chunks. For Grant, it's his first chance to touch a full-size stump. He's quickly in the water, mask and snorkel. The pieces are brought in, and the dive crew decides to return the stump to exactly the same spot they pulled it up from. Then the team calls it a day, returning with the first ever samples pulled from the ancient site.
Underwater lumberjacks. You know, it really drives home the fact that sea levels change. So they change over time, and that where we're at right now used to be a big cypress forest. So it's pretty cool.
Back on land, Grant is a professor in the forestry department at the University of Southern Mississippi. The samples ended up in his laboratory there, where they were carefully dried and prepared for examination.
Yeah, the opportunity to really study this site, to kind of reveal clues of what the climate was like in the Gulf Coast region is very rare. You know, there are very few natural archives of long-term climate change here in the Gulf Coast region. So to have this site uncovered by a hurricane of enormous stumps still rooted in the sediments that they were sort of covered up with is a very rare and unique opportunity. When we ran those samples with the bandsaw, you can smell the resin, just like you were cutting into a fresh piece of wood today. Same thing happened when we sanded them down, right? They smelled fresh, very well preserved. You know, given the fact that these samples are, you know, thousands of years old, I was astonished.
One of the most surprising discoveries was the sap that leaked out of the wood when it was cut. Sap that had to be tens of thousands of years old.
Given the fact that the growth rings are still visible, wood fibers are still visible, it was very surprising.
As soon as he began looking under the microscope, Grant could tell these trees grew in a very different world from the one we know today.
Interesting thing about these rings, each cell is around the same size, which is not like bald cypress today. Usually the cells will change in size. Cells will get much smaller, which gives it a darker appearance. But all of these cells are relatively the same size. Indicates something different in the environment or climatically than today.
The growth rings are much, much more narrow in the underwater forest samples than they are in bald cypress today. Either sort of indicates that it was a lot drier at the time, or perhaps if the trees at that time were responding more to temperature, then it means that temperature was a little bit cooler than it is now.
So one of the things we've been working on is trying to figure out how old the trees are. And at first, just based on water depth and looking at the sea level curves, we thought the trees should be in the 10,000 to 12,000 range. But we took some wood samples, sent them off to get radiocarbon dated, and surprising results. They were not able to date them because the trees are so old that we can't use radiocarbon methods to do the dating. So we went out with the coastal profiler from LSU, and we collected some sediment cores. And in those sediment cores, right above the level where the wood is, we had some other pieces of wood. So we collected those pieces of wood, sent those off to get radiocarbon dated. And those dates came back about 42,000 years old. And we have a second date that we got back that was 45,000 years old. So this tells us that we're in the ballpark of between 50 to about 60,000 years ago for the actual wood pieces. But we still don't have those solid dates that we'd like to have as scientists. So 40 to 45,000 years ago, sea level is not stable. It's increasing and decreasing, increasing and decreasing. And some of this is, tens of meters in just 1,000 years. We're in this period called marine isotope stage 3. And this is where we're going into full glacial conditions, but it's not fully glaciated yet. It's colder, it's windier. And one of the things paleoclimatologists want to understand about this period is what was happening to different ecosystems. How was a bald cypress swamp responding to these changes in sea level and it getting colder? So far, it looks like all the trees experienced some stress events. So something happened to all of them where their growth decreased really rapidly, and then it had a rapid increase. And then the growth decreases really rapidly again, and it looks like all the trees died about the same time.
Christine brought in a team of marine geologists with sophisticated sonar to see if clues to what killed the trees might be buried in the sand surrounding the forest, which actually lies in a deep hole. They found hundreds more trees at the site, buried under 9 feet of sand and mud.
So that's what's really exciting about this work that we're doing is we have this forest that's buried, and we can go out and see the forest when we dive. We can map it with our geophysical, and we could see how big this forest is, what the diameter of the trees were. From those diameters, we can start to look at their ages, how healthy they were, how big they were. So it tells us a lot about that ecosystem, and everything's in place. That was the ecosystem, has just been buried and preserved through time.
Back in the lab, Christine's crew analysed the sediment cores, looking for charcoal from forest fires and ancient pollen that might have been entombed with the trees when they were buried.
So these are some pictures of the pollen from our bald cypress site in the Gulf of Mexico, and this is a picture of a bald cypress pollen grain. These are grass pollens, and then also tupelo, which is another type of tree that exists on the Gulf Coast today. So being able to look at an ecosystem that's 40 to 50,000 years ago can tell us a lot about what was happening with climate and with sea level rise, very rapid sea level rise for different types of ecosystems. And taking that type of response will help inform us about what possibly could happen in the future as we experience sea level rise and as our coastlines change. Particularly here on the Gulf Coast, we have problems with subsidence. We're losing our coastlines. We're losing our saltwater marshes. So what will happen to these ecosystems as the sea starts to encroach inland?
For Christine, Marty and the other scientists, studying this ancient forest is really about understanding the future of our planet.
But if we're 9+ miles or so offshore right now, pretty rapid change geologically speaking. 60 feet of seawater, and I'm looking at a pretty substantial shoreline of development of high rises, of people's shore homes, condominiums, etc. So, it's predicting the future and maybe an unpleasant one. So, you know, it may happen in 5 years, it may happen in 10, it may not happen in my lifetime, but it's certainly going to happen.
Scientific work in the ancient site is just beginning, and the scientists can only speculate what discoveries await. From clues about how quickly the seas rose dozens of millennia ago, to information about the plants and animals that called this forest home. In the coming years, as the mysteries are unwrapped, lessons learned from this distant and watery past may prove crucial to choices we make in our own ever-changing world.